So it's finally here, it's ban day, or ban announcement day, or should I say it was yesterday. I'm filming this the day after because I was spending time with family yesterday. Let's talk about Nadu getting the ban alongside everything else that's hit a ban in Pioneer, in Modern, and some restrictions in Vintage too. If you're looking to pick up single or sealed product to help support the channel, use the link in the description below to coolstuffinc.com. 5% off your order if you use the code KENOBI at checkout, and it helps support the show. We finally got a ban announcement on August the 26th, which was yesterday, having multiple bans across multiple formats: Pioneer, Modern, Legacy, and Vintage, and Explorer, which is basically Pioneer Lite on the Arena client. And we got an update about the ban and restriction announcements going forwards. One of the big complaints by a lot of people, myself included, was the fact that they had just explicitly told us that this ban announcement would come a month into RCQ season. The fact that they knew that Modern was a hot pile of garbage right now because of Nadu, and they were just going to give it a month anyway. They didn't want to ban out a card that people might have bought after the Pro Tour. This was all an unfortunate byproduct of a ban schedule that just didn't line up very well with both the competitive scene in general and the dates of the events that Wizards have put on, and with the expectations of the player base and understanding what the formats would look like moving forward, not having to sit around twiddling their thumbs while they wait to find out what gets banned. So moving forward, we're going to have the ban and restriction announcement be tied to the RCQ and Pro Tour season to allow people to know what the format will look like going into the competitive season. This is good, and I mean that. This is a really good change. The sad part of it is that the next ban and restriction announcement is December, which means that if anything goes wrong between now and then, we're going to be sat twiddling our thumbs for approximately 4 months. I just think that there should be more regular check-ins than this, if I'm honest. That's how I feel. Beyond that, some people are upset that Grief got the axe because they thought it was safe because it wasn't banned last time round. So I'm going to go through each and all of the bans and explain some of the logic behind it and some thoughts on it myself too. Starting with Pioneer, we had Amalia Benavides Aguirre banned. I hope I didn't butcher the name too badly there. Basically, Amalia was banned. Amalia was a combo deck in which the deck would oppressively wrath the board and draw cards, essentially, and it was consistent because of cards like Court of Calling and Collected Company allowing it to be consistent. Creature decks tend to be consistent when they have access to tutors and companies. We've seen this in Modern in the past, and we're now seeing it in Pioneer too. Amalia had been on the watch list from the previous ban announcement, and no one was shocked to see it go. It felt like an inevitability, a when more than an if. Sorin Imperious Bloodlord is also banned, a card that basically didn't see any play up until the point that Vein Ripper was printed into the format, and it saw play and won a Pro Tour by Seth Mansfield 1 Pro Tour ago. The fascinating thing about this is that it was another under the radar sort of situation where the parts had released and no one had really noticed, and then it dominated the Pro Tour. Some people noticed, but it wasn't a big talking point online. People weren't getting really excited about Sorin into Vein Ripper. Eventually, it obviously was good enough to win a Pro Tour, and then continued to be so good because it's difficult to come back from the opponent playing a Planeswalker, then getting a 7 or 8 mana creature for much cheaper, and then you've got to pay life and sack a body to get rid of it, and it's a very hard thing to come back from once the opponent has enacted this game plan of turn 1 Thoughtseize, turn 2 kill your thing, turn 3 Sorin into Vein Ripper. It's pretty rough. Neither of these were unexpected, and they seem like the good bans really. Amalia just neuters the deck completely and destroys it from orbit. Some people might argue that was a bit too heavy-handed. And Sorin, on the other hand, is the piece you need to remove because Sorin makes the design space for future big vampires difficult. If you remove Vein Ripper now and put another 6, 7 or 8 mana mythic nonsense vampire in the future, you open up that whole can of worms again. So Sorin seems like the correct pick here. I don't really play any Pioneer, mainly because these decks kind of are boring to play against. Maybe this will incite me to play some more. If you want to see a certain format played on the channel, tell me in the comment section below. If you think I should try Pioneer with these decks now banned, let me know. Then in Modern, we had Nadu Winged Wisdom banned. Look, I'm not going to go into great detail here simply because I've done 2 or 3 videos about Nadu on its ascension to the top, its Pro Tour victory, and the ensuing aftermath of a late ban announcement, meaning the format was basically a dead duck. Nadu was bonkers and a huge mistake. Michael Majors has done an entire article on it over on the Mothership, in which he explains the mistake was largely due in part to them trying to tune it for Commander. That is a whole can of worms that I'm just going to do a whole separate video on. Today's the ban announcements, later today or tomorrow will be the Nadu was for Commander video, and the day after will be the 5 or 6 worst design mistakes ever brought to you by Commander. Unfortunately written, recorded, uploaded and thumbed prior to this admission that Nadu is the problem, but I guess it still hits the same wider talking points and puts my opinions on that across. Nardu was fucking nonsense. And if anything, the only good thing to come out of Nardu was the litmus test of whether the player you're talking to has either played Modern or isn't a moron. Because someone will tell you the only reason people want Nardu banned is because they're not playing removal. And that person saying that's a fucking idiot. And then Grief was also banned, which is super interesting. Grief has been a problem in the format for a while, and I've said in this channel multiple times that I wish I shouted about it earlier when I was shouting about how bad Fury was for the decks that I like to play. Decks full of mana dorks and utility creatures. Grief does something a little bit different in the sense that it's not a 4 for 1 or a 4 for 2 sometimes, instead going card disadvantage to attack the hand for free. But when you start to add on the fact that you can reanimate it to get a 3 for 2, but 2 of those cards that you're hitting are the opponent's best cards, it becomes quickly oppressive and difficult to deal with. The interesting about Grief right now is that it's just not that good in the format, namely because the Nardu decks were dominating everything, and I don't think turn wanting a Grief into the Nardu deck is even a line that gets you over the finish line. Part of me wonders if the reason they hit Grief here, there's multiple reasons they could have done it. The first is in a way a sacrificial gesture to the court of public opinion. People are pissed off with Grief and they're pissed off with the Modern Horizons cards. In banning Grief, you're finally throwing a bone to that crowd, to the very vocal online crowd, of which I am included in that crowd. And it also distracts from the fact that Modern Horizons 2, Lord of the Rings and Modern Horizons 3 had a lot of other egregious shit in it already. I've done a whole video on this, but I think the energy package will see a ban at some point in the next 12 months as it becomes the omnipresent best thing to do in the format, bearing in mind that Boros Energy, Mardu Energy, and Jesco Control, which is also an energy deck, all use the same suite of energy cards. This will become the best thing to do in the format. But the other reason that Grief might have got the axe is that it's because they know there's just more stuff coming up in Duskmourn that's going to make Grief busted. More reanimation style effects, more ways in which making your opponent discard a card on turn 1 and for 0 mana is better. Maybe something else pushes Grief further down the line and they feel like they just need to get out under it before it happens. They also mentioned briefly that the One Ring is a card that they have considered talking about. And they claim at present several decks use it, but there's no clear One Ring deck terrorizing the format, which is basically a description you could use to describe Grief, if we're honest. It's weird, the logic that Grief is good in like Mono Black, Espagorio's Vengeance, Living End, Rakdos Midrange, and similar, all these decks that aren't oppressing the format right now, but then flip to the One Ring, which is being played in like Eldrazi, Control, Tron, and multiple other decks that I'm probably like blanking on right now. It's the same logic. So why did the One Ring get to live? There is the argument that the One Ring is a much better play pattern. I think that's debatable. I think the opponent drawing cards and getting protected for a turn, then playing another ring on the following turn and being protected again, getting 2 turns of like Time Warp against you playing creature decks or aggro decks or some sort of aggressive game plan is just as unfun as getting, well, it's probably moderately, maybe 10% less fun than or 10% more fun than getting Griefed on turn 1, maybe. Part of me wonders if we aren't far enough away from Lord of the Rings for the One Ring to get banned yet. There's also, if I'm honest, this might be a bit tinfoil hat time, but it is the leading titular card of an IP. It is important to the brand relationship and contracts and deals that were done with Middle-earth Enterprises or whatever they were called. Is there a point of not wanting to get that banned whilst Lord of the Rings is still in recent memory? Is it the idea that they might want to appease previous brand partners by not banning out the card that everyone knows about because they did a viral lottery ticket campaign around it? I want to assume that isn't the case, but I just don't understand the logic as to why Grief took out behind the shed and shot and the One Ring didn't. Other than if we are, you know, generous and said Duskmourn might hold the answers and we just can't see them yet. They joke at the end of the modern bit about how Necrodominance is now a thing and Psychic Frog moved Murktide and Delver towards blue-black, and what other power will we see from the Modern Horizons 3 card pool that Nardu is now gone. And it's just so funny that it's like the power crypt well is deep, but it was overshadowed by the most power crept card, which was Nardu, which was an accident, wasn't even intentionally power crept. I think this is all just very, very funny. It's very, very funny that the focus is on what will Modern Horizons 3 still bring to the format, not what can we bring back from this non-rotating format where other things should be playable. It's sad, really. And then in Legacy, Grief got banned as well because it's worse in Legacy. Again, I've talked about this a few times on the channel, but I'll reiterate this a bit clearer because it's not been as prominent as the Nardu conversation, but Grief is a pain in everyone's fucking arse. It's worse in Legacy simply because Reanimate and Animate Dead are better than all the other options in other formats, especially Reanimate itself. And it ended up being that Grief was a a key part of the reanimate deck itself that isn't one of the big fatties you gotta get into the bin. It's something that can be pitched from its hand off its own ability, die, and then be reanimated to hit 2 cards from their hand. It plays under a lot of the graveyard hate that people might keep in their hand ready to hit a Grizzlebrand or an Atraxa in the traditional reanimator matchups. Of course, reanimate, Daze, and Force of Will are sacred cows of the format that cannot be considered for removal from the format. I mean, I'm saying this not sarcastically. I think Force of Will should always stay. I do think Reanimate or Daze at some point have to go for the sins of the things they don't enable. Daze has been a bit player in Delver being an oppressive deck with all sorts of new power crept shit always being prominently played in Delver for years. Your Okos, your Astrolabes, and similar. So maybe one day Daze should go, but I guess people want to play with Daze somewhere, and that's Legacy. Psychic Fog was the other consideration for Legacy for a ban. It's the one that people talked about the most, I think. But I do appreciate the softly approach of banning one thing out. I guess the problem with this is that we won't see another ban announcement for, I don't know, 4 months. So if Psychic Fog becomes oppressive, we're back to where we were again. I genuinely think if they're going to keep pushing the power level of the cards that they print, they have to be more heavy-handed and more regular with bans. I'd much prefer they were gentler with what they injected into the formats, but that's not something that Wizards are going to listen to a little YouTuber from England about, is it? And then in Vintage, Urza's Saga was one of the top 5 most played non-restricted cards and is now restricted. You got to bear in mind that artifacts are like the de facto best thing to be doing in a Vintage, and Urza's Saga enables them in more ways than one, with beaters that are powered up by them and finding them. You got to remember that Vintage has the power 9 in it. So Urza's Saga finding a Black Lotus consistently on turn like 4 or so is a thing that was regularly happening. The weird thing is that no one was clamoring for this. There was no real community outcry that I saw. And that just might be an argument there's not much of a Vintage community talking about this stuff online anyway. That might be why I never saw it. I'm not surprised, but at the same time, it wasn't expected either. It's very much of a, that kind of makes sense. And then Vexing Bauble was heavily played too, because it stops a lot of the bullshit that you can get up to with Vexing Bauble. So I guess they want to not make the format completely hostile to combo decks and decks that want to play spells for free, so they've restricted Vexing Bauble. Ultimately, nothing was really that extreme. I was expecting heavier handed and maybe even an unban somewhere, maybe in Modern, for example. But instead, we had quite a softly approach to most of the formats. The Grief ban feels weird. I'm glad to see it go. I fucking hate playing against Grief. I think the card is a gross design. But it's weird to see Grief go and the One Ring stay. That surprised me. If you want to hear me talk more about the design mistake that is explicitly Nadu for one final time, that'll be the next video on the channel, so make sure you're subscribed to catch that one, and let me know what you think of the bans of restricted announcement in the comment section below. Is it bringing you back to Modern? Is it bringing you back to Legacy? Will you finally try Pioneer or Vintage? Let me know in the comment section below. I've been Vince, also PleasantKenobi on the internet. I'll see you in the next one. Ta-ta for now.